Hello class. In this video we're going to be looking at some of Edmund Spenser's shorter poems. We'll be looking at some selections from the Shepheardes Calendar and some of the sonnets from the Amoretti. The image you see here in the background is the headpiece to the April eclogue in the Shepheardes Calendar. And I chose this one because it portrays a rusticated Queen Elizabeth surrounded by shepherds and various female figures who represent the nine muses, and we'll be looking at that passage specifically a little later in this video. So I decided not to include an outline of Spenser's life in this presentation. If you would like to see that, you can look at one of the videos on the Fairy Queen. We have enough to cover in this one. So the Shepheardes Calendar was published anonymously in 1579. So the same decade as Gascoigne's Hundred Sundry Flowers. The publisher, Hugh Singleton, was an interesting figure. He had issued a Puritan pamphlet critical of the Queen's relationship with the French Duke of Anjou, which many English people feared would create a more Catholic climate in England. And for that, Singleton and nearly had his hand chopped off as punishment for that. And a few months later, he published the Shepheardes Calendar. So there may be actually some carefully veiled criticism of the Queen's suitors in the calendar, but Spenser's choice to remain anonymous probably had more to do with the gutsiness of his literary ambition, which comes through, his anxiety about that comes through in the preface to the book. Some of Spenser's poems had appeared in print during his student days at Cambridge, but this book was his first independent published work and a truly bold experiment in poetic language and form. There's the title page for it. The Shepheardes Calendar, containing 12 eclogues proportionable to the 12 months. What's really notable about this title page is the dedication right on the front. To the noble and virtuous gentleman, most worthy of all titles, both of learning and chivalry, Master Philip Sidney. Obviously, an attempt to lend some authority to the publication of a poet who was at that time still relatively unknown. So the Shepheardes Calendar is a conscious imitation of ancient pastoral or sometimes bucolic poetry. Those terms are used synonymously. This is a genre that idealizes simple rural life, though this simplicity often serves to disguise the poet's commentary on social and political issues. Certainly true of Virgil, and many would argue true of Spenser as well. Spenser mentions both the Greek poet Theocritus, who called his pastoral poems Idylls, and the later Roman poet Virgil, who called his eclogues, and that's the term that Sidney or Spenser uses for his. These poems, the Idylls of Theocritus, the eclogues of Virgil, together with more recent French and Italian imitations, particularly those of Battista of Mantua or Mantuan, were often used to teach boys like Spenser classical and European languages. Spenser was by no means the first English poet to experiment with pastoral, but the calendar certainly elevated the genre and displayed its adaptability to different themes and a dazzling array of verse forms. And it was enormously popular and appeared in several editions during Spenser's lifetime. So some of the traits of pastoral, I'll just put I got 5 of them there. First is a rustic setting and rustic diction. So Spenser establishes a realistic rural environment in which his characters move and speak. And we see this right off the bat in the opening stanza of the first eclogue, January, where he describes the shepherd Colin Clout, who's wandering this desolate winter Kentish landscape with his starving sheep. And then in the final stanza, with frosty night coming on, he returns home with them. So these rustic settings and the simplified language of country folk is an essential aspect of the pastoral form. Along with that are bucolic personae. So pastoral poets would adopt one or perhaps several bucolic personae or masks, typically the figure of a shepherd or goatherd. Colin Clout is the foremost of these figures in the Shepheardes calendar. He is the solitary speaker in the first and last poems of the sequence, January and December, and he's regarded by his rustic companions as the finest poet among them. This is mentioned several times. There are 4 other herdsmen that speak in the other 3 eclogues that we'll be looking at, April, October, and November. And their names are Thenot, Habanal, Pierce, and Cuddy. There are frequent hints in the poems, as well as the extensive editorial apparatus surrounding the poems, that indicate that Colin Clout is none other than Spenser himself. And in fact, Colin Clout appears in other poems by Spenser after the Shepheardes calendar. He actually appears in, I believe he appears in book 6 of The Faerie Queene. Another aspect of the pastoral are monologues and dialogues. Some poems, like January, take the form of monologues with a solitary speaker, Colin Clout in January, while others, like October, take the form of dialogues between speakers who echo each other's stanza lengths and verse patterns, and these are called amoebian stanzas. Pierce and Cuddy speak in sextains of iambic pentameter, and they do it with only 2 rhyming sounds, which is pretty extraordinary. As for the topics of pastoral poetry, love, religion, husbandry are the big ones, but mainly love. One of the primary themes of the Shepheardes calendar is love, specifically Colin Clout's unrequited love for a country girl named Rosalind. And another topic is whether love is fit subject matter for a talented poet with lofty aspirations. And then finally, we can talk about allusions to the Greco-Roman pantheon of gods and goddesses. It was important for later vernacular poets, that is, poets writing in French, Italian, English, to acknowledge their ancient literary models and display their learning. This was a way for the poet to establish artistic legitimacy and accrue cultural capital to himself. By incorporating frequent allusions to Greco-Roman mythology and history, as Spenser does, for example, when Colin, actually this is a song recited by his friend Habanal, mentions the story of Niobe and the slaughter of her children by Apollo and Diana as a warning against hubris, and that occurs in the April eclogue, lines 86 to 90. So in addition to the different rustic characters that appear in the eclogues, Spenser also created a fictional editor using the initials EK, who provides commentary on the poems in copious notes or glosses that sometimes seem longer than the poems themselves, but they're absolutely important and they're integral to the entire project. Their purpose is not only to define difficult words and clarify arcane expressions, of which there are many, but also, and perhaps more importantly, I think, to display Spenser's extensive knowledge of ancient philosophy and literature, and thereby lending the whole project a greater legitimacy and authority. This rarefied, very dense scholarly apparatus in a work that in many respects resembled the homely and widely read almanacs of the period contributes significantly to the strange hybrid nature of the Shepheardes calendar. So, what Spenser hoped to accomplish with the Shepheardes calendar, again, his first significant literary achievement, is laid out in a preface that is signed, again, by this fictional editor, E.K., that doubles as a dedication to Spenser's close Cambridge friend and prosodist Gabriel Harvey, who is identified with the figure of Hobbinol in the Eclogues. So we'll talk about some of the objectives of the preface. First, to follow in the footsteps of Geoffrey Chaucer. That is the purpose of the Shepheardes calendar, to follow in the footsteps of Geoffrey Chaucer, the lodestar of our language, he's called, right at the beginning of the preface, and reform English literary culture by restoring the ancient English vernacular. And E.K. devotes over half the preface to this carefully worded apology for the poet's use of archaic words. Another aspect of this project is to justify the poet's choice of the Eclogue as the vehicle for this literary reformation. E.K. explains in the preface that many great poets, like Virgil, began their careers writing eclogues before graduating to more serious and prestigious forms, like epic. And I think Spenser saw the Faerie Queene as the realization of that Virgilian trajectory. The third objective of the preface is to explain the subject matter, that is Colin Clout's long wandering in the common labyrinth of love, and also to explain the calendrical organization of the material. Of course, E.K. wants to explain the function of the gloss or scholium for the exposition of old words and harder phrases. That starts around line 180 of the preface. And then finally, to use Sidney's rank, as he did on the title page, and Harvey's scholarly reputation as a prophylactic bulwark against the volume's anticipated critics. Quoting the preface here, the malice and outrage of so many enemies, as I know, will be set on fire with the sparks of his, that is Spenser's, kindled glory. And that's right at the very conclusion, near the conclusion of the preface. So let's take a look at how all this is actually laid out. Looking at the Shepheardes calendar in the textbook really doesn't give you a good idea of how this looked to Elizabethan readers. So here is the opening page of January, and you can already see, looking at this, that there are elements here that do not appear in our text. For example, the illustrations, these woodcuts that appear as headpieces to each of the eclogues. This one's January. You see Colin Clout there. His sheep don't look particularly miserable, but his pipe, you see his pipe looks like a bagpipe, actually, which is interesting, broken on the ground. Each of the eclogues is also preceded by an argument or a summary, and you'll notice the change in typeface once we get to the eclogues themselves. This black letter typeface would have seemed old-fashioned even to readers in 1579. So an interesting aesthetic choice for the eclogues. And I am grateful that we don't have to read it in black letter. So at the end of January, the poems, the eclogues end with a Latin emblem or posy, similar to what we saw in Gascoigne's Hundred Sundry Flowers. It's a Latin phrase, and they all are glossed by EK. And speaking of the glosses, there it is at the end of the eclogue, and you'll notice that they're in a modern typeface. And actually, I think that the layout here with the hanging indents makes EK's glosses easier to read in their original form than they are in our version of the text. So we are looking at 4 of the eclogues. There's January, the speaker is Colin Clout. April, which is a dialogue between Thenot and Hobbinol, although Hobbinol winds up reciting a poem, a song by Colin Clout, a panegyric to Queen Elizabeth. October is Pierce and Cuddy, and then November, the speakers are Thenot and Colin Clout again. So just I'm just going to point out a few passages from each of these that I think are of special interest. This first one, this is from January. Rosalind rejects Colin's love and scorns his poetry, a very typical sort of Petrarchan convention. That's lines 61 through 66 of January. And I really like a passage in the middle, the winter landscape, description of the winter landscape, which becomes this elaborate objective correlative for Colin's love melancholy. And then in the gloss, what I find most remarkable about the whole eclogue, the whole January eclogue, is actually not in the poem, but in EK's remarks on Hobbinol's love friendship, this kind of homosocial world of Cambridge that gets mentioned here or alluded to. Hobbinol's love for Colin, and how careful EK is here to distinguish it from homosexual desire, and that's lines 32 to 50 of EK's gloss. So moving on now to the April eclogue. This is Thenot and Hobbinol. They start off discoursing on Colin's love melancholy and the wasted poetic talent. And they start off in quatrains of iambic pentameter rhyming AB, AB, which is pretty straightforward. But once Hobbinol begins to recite from memory one of Colin's more ambitious songs, a panegyric on Queen Elizabeth called Eliza in the song. This begins at line 37. The rhyme scheme gets a lot more complicated. This is a 9-line scheme, similar in terms of length to the Spenserian stanza, but it's made up of very different syllabic feet. So, for example, there are iambic lines, there are dimeter lines with only 2 stressed syllables, and then the last line is a tetrameter line. So very, very complicated rhyme scheme, but not the most complicated. We'll get to that one when we come to November. So there's a description of Queen Elizabeth that begins at line 55, and the lines that really stand out to me are her blushing cheeks being compared to roses, which EK glosses at some length as an allusion to the Tudor rose. That's lines 116 to 27 of his gloss. And then he apologizes for the rustic poet in his ignorance, giving her court this pastoralian setting in lines 50 to 60. And then finally, in the poem, in the eclogue, Colin sees Calliope. This is the muse of epic poetry. She's in the Queen's retinue at lines 100 to 108 with the other muses, and this is an indication of Colin's poetic aspirations, of where he could go if he followed in the footsteps of Virgil, that he could rise to the level of heroic poetry. But all that is forsaken when he falls in love with Rosalind, and then ends up turning his back on poetry and breaking his pipes. The October Eclogue is a dialogue between Piers and Cuddy. E.K. suggests that Cuddy may actually be Colin Clout. That is another avatar of Spenser, and he's described as the perfect pattern of a poet in the argument to the Eclogue. The only problem is he lives in a world that no longer inspires or supports poetry, which is really the subject of the October Eclogue. The subject is poetry and the state of poetry in 16th century England. E.K. expounds at length on how poets were valued in ancient times, consulted by philosophers, lines 22 to 69, and admired by military leaders, lines 120 to 57. So these extensive glosses are clearly in line with what Cuddy says about poetry. So Piers encourages Cuddy to rehabilitate his stalled poetic career by treating didactic, heroic, or religious subjects, all of which Cuddy refuses to do, arguing that moral poetry, although entertaining and although appreciated, it does not put food on the table. That's lines 31 to 36 of the Eclogue. He says that the age of heroes is no more, so can't write heroic poetry, and this resembles very much what Spenser would later say about the age of chivalry in The Faerie Queene. And finally, he says he lacks the talent or capacity to write spiritual verse in lines 85 to 90. He says that Colin Clout is the one who has that kind of ability, but unfortunately he has squandered it on love poetry. So they consider Colin's current condition, and they debate whether the subject of love is in fact capable of elevating the poet. And Cuddy's answer to that is resoundingly negative. So finally, we come to the November Eclogue. This is between Thenaut and Colin Clout, the penultimate Eclogue. And E.K., the editor, considers this to be the best of the Eclogue. So Spenser's basically saying this is my finest achievement in this book. That's in the argument before the Eclogue begins on page 797. And it contains, this Eclogue contains some of Spenser's most intricate verse patterns. This is a 10-line stanza. Colin's Elegy is a 10-line stanza that has a complicated rhyme scheme and metrical structure. It starts with a hexameter line, interestingly enough, six stressed syllables, with a mixture of pentameter, tetrameter, and dimeter lines. The two dimeter lines, heavy hearse and careful verse, form a variable 3-line refrain that changes to happy hearse and joyful verse starting at line 170. This poem, imitated after a French elegy by Clément Marot, set the standard for later pastoral elegies by the likes of Mary Sidney Herbert with her elegy for her brother Philip Sidney, Milton's Lycidas, Shelley's Adonais. All of these pastoral elegies follow this model. So the subject of this one is a country girl called Dido. That's not her actual name. You know, the true identity is this big secret. But she died by drowning, apparently. And so, urged by Thenot, Colin describes this great chain of grieving that starts with his fellow herdsmen at line 103, and then expands to include the natural world, all of the natural world, animals and so forth, at line 125, and then finally includes mythic beings like the Muses and the Fates, starting at line 143. Towards the end of the poem, Colin moralizes on death, emphasizing the vanity of earthly things, but then he ends with a recognizably Christian consolation in pagan trappings from lines 153 to 80. So, Dido's gone to heaven. She's happier there. We should be happy for her. And hopefully one day we will get to join her there. E.K.'s gloss to this poem is notable, I think, for his remarks on George Gascoigne, starting at line 72, remembering that Gascoigne's book, A Hundred Sundry Flowers, this pseudo-anthology, had come out earlier in the 1570s, and that book and the Shepheardes Calendar really were the two major literary achievements of that decade. So if the Shepheardes Calendar marks the beginning of Sidney's career as a poet, his sonnet sequence, Amoretti, published together with the marriage song Epithalamion in 1595, comes near the end of that career, with the sixth book, Fairy Queen, appearing the following year in 1596. And he actually alludes to that project in number 80 of the Amoretti. You could take a look at that. It's in our book. He mentions being tired after writing the sixth book, Fairy Queen, and talks about turning to love poetry as a kind of relief. While Colin Clout is reproached by his peers for wasting his poetic energy on Rosalind, a woman he will never win, in these late poems, Spenser celebrates his love for Elizabeth Boyle, a woman that he successfully courted and married in 1594. I believe, apparently his first wife had died. And the poet's success at achieving his desire, marrying his second wife, Elizabeth Boyle, is what distinguishes Amoretti from other sequences of the period, like Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, which Spenser may have known when it circulated in manuscript in the 1580s, but was published in 1591, just a few years before Amoretti. So we'll look at a half dozen sonnets here. We've read 20-some of the total of 89 sonnets. I've chosen these six to focus on, and we'll start with number 3. Spenser typically follows the English sonnet form of 3 quatrains and a closing couplet, all in iambic pentameter lines. However, his usual rhyme pattern is more complex than normal, requiring 4 each of the B and C rhymes. So A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C, D, C, D, E, E. In this example, sonnet number 3, Spenser exhibits the familiar Petrarchan idealization of the beloved. Her celestial hue elevates his frail spirit from base desires. But what I find most noteworthy is the final 6 lines, where he proclaims his inability to express her beauty by either the spoken or written word, and yet somehow he managed to do that very thing using a transcendent faculty he says resides in the heart. This kind of paradoxical logic is a feature of Petrarchan persone in all the major sequences of the period. Number 22, this is sometimes referred to as the Ash Wednesday sonnet. That's the holy day that's mentioned in line 3. The sonnet sequence as a whole, the Amoretti, does correspond to the liturgical calendar, with number 68 alluding to Easter. It's far more complicated than this. But since we're not reading all the sonnets in the sequence, it's hard to make the case for it. But in both these sonnets, number 22 and number 68, Spenser attempts to give his love this virtuous Christian overlay, Although here in number 22, the worship of his sweet saint certainly savors of pagan idolatry. And I think that it enough that it would have made some of his readers, particularly Protestant readers, uncomfortable. Number 37. So, without question, this is one of the most sinister sonnets in the sequence. Here, Spenser takes up the Petrarchan convention of the beloved as femme fatale, whose beauty, in this instance enhanced by artificial ornaments, is perilous to men who cannot suppress their base appetites. Dante Rossetti would riff on this theme in the Victorian period in his House of Life sonnets with a really famous sonnet about, I think it's Lady Lilith. You can look that up if you're curious. Sonnet 54. This is an example. This example is interesting, I think, for its use of theater metaphors. The 1590s when this was published. Shakespeare is just beginning to make a name for himself with his history plays. And Spenser uses theater metaphors in this sonnet to recount his frustrations wooing Elizabeth. She's a tough audience for his performances. And in this poem, the sweet saint of sonnet number 22 becomes a senseless stone. And that's the last line of the sonnet. Number 74, Spenser expresses appreciation to three important women in his life, all of them named Elizabeth. His mother in lines 5 through 6, the queen, who, remember, had rewarded him with a lifetime pension for his fairy queen in lines 7 through 8, and then finally his new bride, Elizabeth Boyle, who gets an entire quatrain to herself in lines 9 through 12. One of my personal favorites is number 75. The sonnet begins with a lovely but very somber beach scene where he's writing Elizabeth's name in the sand with a piece of driftwood or something, and the tide keeps coming in and washing it away. But the sonnet takes up the idea that the poet is capable of immortalizing his beloved in verse. You shall live by fame, he says. My verse, your virtues rare, shall eternize. This is a theme that would be taken up by William Shakespeare in his sonnets as well, and we'll be looking at some of those soon. And with that, we'll end this video on Edmund Spenser's shorter poetry. This painting, the three paintings I used in this presentation, not by a Renaissance artist. These are 19th century paintings by the artist Samuel Palmer. I really love this one, and this is a Kentish landscape, and the Shepheardes calendar is supposedly set in Kent using geographical clues that are contained in the egglogs. It is set in the area of Kent.